James Thomas was his name. But he was known as the professor by everyone. Every day I passed him in the hallways. He always left for his morning stroll around the same time I arrived to the landlord's office across from the lobby. Every time he passed, he waved and nodded. I had known him all my life. But how well do you truly know them, as they say? 10 years prior, I had taken over the building from my father, just as he had done with his own father. Despite having just graduated from college and no career prospects, my father fell ill. I then stood up. The building was a substantial, exquisite pre-war construction with more than a dozen spacious flats spread over 4 stories. The entire shakedown, including the building's history and blueprints, everything I hadn't known while growing up there, was delivered to me when the keys were turned over. Like many apartment complexes, this one too had long kept secrets. But this one had a hidden feature. A decoy wall in the top corner penthouse led to a walking crawl passage that directed you to a secret room. The professor was the apartment's tenant, and ever since I learned about it, I've worried if he's aware of it. I didn't really know him. He was aware of my family, though. Since my grandfather owned the building, he had been there. I did know that James had taught physics, algebra, and other hard sciences in the past. He had many PhDs and doctoral degrees in a range of topics. Despite being long since retired, he spent most of his time trudging in and out of his apartment while toting books that appeared to be at least as old as he was. Of course, I constantly offered to assist, but he always politely declined. He would talk to himself in the halls, as if he were continuously solving challenging puzzles in his thoughts. He did, however, occasionally come across as borderline or schizophrenic. I suppose that having a mind that thinks so quickly, consistently, and intricately makes routine encounters seem completely meaningless. Even with someone like myself, who, despite holding the title of landlord, had always found mathematics and physics intriguing and had studied them to the extent that my mental faculties would allow. Simply put, there never seemed to be any progress in trying to talk to him about any of it. Even yet, he was always friendly, and the rent dutifully showed up 2 days early. The situation had evolved over the past few months though. Only at night would I see or hear him moving in and out. Usually at the same hour. 3 a.m. He also asked if he could view our surveillance footage of the front entrances outside, making him seem more paranoid than normal. I took him into the office and showed him the dates he was requesting. He omitted all context and information regarding what or who he was looking for. He finished, thanked me, and then walked away. I re-watched the video, but all I could see was a white van that appeared and then vanished across the street. Of which anything could have become. My concern for the professor was growing. What if he had dementia already or was showing signs of it? I was unaware of his family or friends. I should possibly visit him more often. Or try to engage in more meaningful conversations that last longer. Sadly, I was never given the opportunity. The first of the month arrived, and the professor's rent was still not in. In reality, it had been a few days since I had seen him. I climbed all the way to the 4th floor. Since the professor wasn't responding to my knocks, I used the master key to gain entry. I discovered the professor dead on the kitchen floor as soon as I smelled him. When paramedics responded to my plea for help, they declared him dead and said the COD seemed to be a heart attack. At least 3 days had passed since he appeared to be dead. As I led them away, I noticed that our street now had numerous black Lincolns and a dozen white vans with men in black suits getting out of them. They appeared official. 3 of the men came over and questioned if I was the landlord Frank Kelly. They identified themselves as members of the Harlow family and informed me that they needed immediate entry to his flat. I claimed to have known him my entire life and that I had no idea he had a family. They declared that it didn't matter to them and that they would still go in. Without or with my permission. 2 sizable, unmarked moving trucks then rolled onto the roadway. As the paramedics loaded Harlow's body into the ambulance, 1 of the vans and 3 of the Lincolns trailed closely behind. The remainder of the evening was spent observing the men in black suits removing everything from the professor's residence. They made swift, stealthy movements. In fact, it was so silent that I didn't hear a single tenant complaint. The moving trucks and Lincolns had left in the morning, along with practically all of the vans. Almost. One was still standing in front, across the street. Before lunch, I called the hospital to ask about the delivery of the professor's body and the preparations being made. But there was no record of a visitor with the administrators. Last night, there was only one call to our region, and the responding paramedics identified it as a joke. I noted the van's license plate since I was curious about what was happening. I asked our police officer tenant if he could look into it as he was one of our tenants. He contacted me again an hour later. I was correct, the van had official license plates. High caliber. The tenant policeman told me to keep my head down but was unable to even identify which branch. This is something I've never been good at. Was the professor onto anything the government wanted to know about last night, given how quickly and secretively everything happened? Is there a plot? Theories? Possibly an algorithm? Since they confiscated all Dad owned, I knew I would never learn the truth. Everything in his apartment, even the light bulbs, was gone. The walls, ceiling, and floors all gave off a bleachy odor. I then recalled the secret room. Had the professor been informed about it? I suppose this was my chance to learn more. I awaited that evening. I kept my flashlight low when I entered the apartment because the government van was still in the driveway. I went to the penthouse's back bedroom, where the trick wall was located. In accordance with what my father had previously explained, I shifted it backwards and upwards. I pushed the panel open and entered after it had moved. I shut it behind me and flipped a temporary switch to turn on the light. The subterranean route became illuminated, and from where I was standing, I could see the secret room. I feared what I may discover. But the moment I stepped inside, my anxiety subsided. The space was entirely occupied by untouched study materials of every description. I suppose the government officials hadn't discovered it. I entered the office and was immediately struck by the sheer volume of books and information that lined the walls and shelves. Anything from linguistics to mathematics to quantum computing and much more, including philosophy and theology. The desk was littered with schematics and notes. A substantial diary with a leather cover was sitting on top of them all. I don't know what struck me, but I grabbed it up without even realizing it. I then heard the apartment's front door close. I froze. Steps were heard in the living room. The brightness, shudder. What if they discover it in the wall panel's crack? I made a stealthy retreat through the walkway to the light switch. As I snapped it off, I stiffened up throughout, scanning the darkness for any additional motion. 2 sets of footsteps and hushed conversation were audible to me. As they entered the bedroom, I experienced a pit in my stomach. Why should I be anxious? I mean, this was my space. So why was I there? The entire building was mine. I should march over there and inquire as to who the devil was occupying my position. I didn't, though. I waited for the 2 sets of feet to exit the apartment while crouching in the pitch-black subterranean passage. I continued to wait for another 10 minutes, just to make sure, as the door shut behind them. I then slipped back through the professor's house and out the trick wall. The hallway outside the room was quiet and deserted, which calmed my fears that there may be someone or something there. As was the descent to my apartment stairs. When I came in, I left the lights off. After triple locking my door, I walked into my study to review the journal I had obtained from the professor. Although I wasn't happy I had gotten it, I was intrigued. What harm could it do at this point? The diary was almost the same size as a phone book. Massive pages of abstract and linear algebra were there, dipping and weaving through topology, cryptography, manifold theories, and tensor calculus. Diagrams and equations from quantum field and continuum mechanics, electromagnetism, and gravitational potentials were incomprehensible. I rapidly became disoriented, but I discovered that there were passages in the journal that helped me remember the understandable, mostly rational man I'd exchanged so many good mornings with in the corridor. It seemed as though the professor would spend hours breaking down these complicated issues across dozens of pages, just to spend an afternoon talking sanely about them for a few pages. The more I read, the less certain I became that these were the ramblings of a madman or the thoughts of someone who knew things that would make a sane man insane. Then there were the illustrations. Stunningly detailed illustrations of horrors that could only exist in a psychopath's imagination. Massive, wriggling monstrosities that blatantly violate biology and physics are reaching and snapping forward to feed. Abominations that, if seen emerging from the waters, would instantly kill millions of people with heart attacks. Our position in the universe has been greatly exaggerated if these things, these impossibly created things, might come to pass and become a part of our reality. I felt as though they tightened their grip on me just by glancing at the paintings, and waves of heat flashed across my body. I had to put down my journal. I was starting to feel it. I lit a cigarette and went to the window. The van remained in place. The longer I possessed the book, the more scary it seemed. But I couldn't help but want to know more. Where did everything go? Now that it was well past midnight, I tried to fall asleep but gave up because it was useless. I stood up, made a whiskey, and opened the journal once more. A lengthy collection of further drawings, violent depictions of the waters rising, opened it. When biblical storms hit cities and villages, there was widespread havoc. Oceanic portals popped up, allowing those unsettling animals to enter our globe in large numbers. Those science-based monsters. Huge tusks protruding from the jaws of the horrors. Not tusks, please. Tentacles, writhing about like the kraken but affixed to mountainous monsters with dragon bodies and teeth. Grasping, reaching, and gnashing. There were justifications for the entities, even brief philosophies. Despite the fact that they were not inherently bad beings, they could quickly overpower us and destroy us. They were simply too far ahead for us to comprehend in terms of morality and ethics. Quite similar to how we could see a mosquito. Or how others could perceive us. Near the conclusion, I quickly skimmed. A sizable piece of tracing paper was tucked into the final pages after being folded down multiple times. I opened it up to reveal what looked like tree roots. Or perhaps it was a tree branch. Or our cardiovascular system? Lines split off from the paper's bottom and extended outward, covering the entire surface. Each line had an X at the end and was drawn out so that it appeared to come to an end. However, one line had a big O at the end of it. Above it, the words Tuscan's Gate were drawn. The triangle was located immediately after the circle and was unconnected to any of the branching lines. It bore the name the Sarkadian Ridge on its label. With the intention of returning to it later, I once again folded the sheet. The most recent entry has 2 words put down at the start and was made 4 days ago. The first word contained 22 letters, whereas the second word contained 31. There was an entire page devoted to the locution of each word, explaining every nuance. The first half of the page provided a point-by-point analysis of how each portion of each letter was to be pronounced and how they blended together. Even when I took my time and carefully said each syllable, it was still very challenging to say the words on their own. But it appeared impossible to adequately articulate them in 2 distinct but flowing shapes. But I kept reading. The professor had noted at the bottom of one of the pages that the 2 terms roughly translated to our world and their world. I once more pulled out the tracing paper. I spread the sheet out on the floor and circled it, taking several angles of observation. Then it dawned on me. I removed a city map from my cabinet and covered it with the tracing paper. Everything on the map, streets, subways, and electrical lines, lined up with a branching thread of a different size on the tracing paper. It was just along the seawall as I looked for the one line that ended at Tuscan's Gate. In front of the gate, the Sarkadian Ridge appeared to be 1 mile offshore. I would be able to see where the gate, or whatever it was if it weren't for the new structure being constructed across the street. The explanation on the last page was very unnerving. They were preparing an assault on our planet with those beings, these bastards of science. The size of us. They would launch an EMP from the Sarkadian Ridge using the Earth's own electromagnetic field, which would have an immediate global impact and disable all electrical and battery-powered devices as well as communications. The storms would then begin. Sea levels would rise and then fall. It would become foggy. And the animals followed it? The ridge was a semi-open fissure between dimensions that could be exploited to enter ours. It was situated on tectonic fault lines that it shared with the gate and looked out over a huge array of geothermal vents. The creatures seemed to be gradually learning how to move through. The human race would vanish in a matter of days if and when they did. Only to fade into cosmic obscurity as a footnote, at most. It was conceivable to see the huge gathering of grotesqueries approaching the ridge on their own plane from the gate and in certain situations by physically arriving there. The professor had also discovered how. Only at a specific period on our plane of reality could it be accessed. 3:47 a.m. The gap between our world and theirs was most permeable at that time. They and we overlapped in space and time in an unseen way. However, time collapsed on itself there. There was no time, as in. There, eons may pass while we are halted in time here. It had been seen and visited by the professor. He returned a changed, troubled man who had lost faith in humanity. The journal's final sentence was scribbled in terror. I tried to halt it, but this is going to be our last breath. Then it was over. The rear cover appeared after a few blank pages. I read the last phrase several times, praying to God that I wasn't reading the musings of a lunatic. A brilliant crazy with twisted wires and a terrifying imagination. But that simply wasn't how it felt. I returned to those two words in the journal. The ones that stood for their world and our world. They featured numerous vowels in a succession and sounded like butchered tongue twisters when I tried to speak them again. I glanced at the clock. 3:30 a.m. Everything was so unsure that I couldn't help but feel nervous. These writings may be the height of madness. Yet the professor did pass away. Additionally, officials did arrive and clear out his residence. They were able to remove his ambulance pickup from the records and somehow erase it. One of their vans was still parked in front. I decided that the only way to know for sure was to follow the professor's lead, so I wrote down the lengthy phrases and put them in my pocket. When he made his notes, he had already gone to Tuscan's gate and spoken the phrase that summoned the dimension of the cursed monstrosities. I would follow suit and have a look for myself if they were real and their world was real. I would at least be aware then. I locked the journal in my safe, but I'm sure that wouldn't safeguard it if the government authorities below knew I had it. I slipped out via a gap in the back fence after sneaking down the service stairs. I descended to the seawall using the side streets and the alley. As close as I could go to the location on the map, I arrived at the seawall. The stars were visible and the sky was clear. It was a lovely night. I had 17 minutes to think out how to say the words as it was also 3:30. I took the paper out and began reading the translation for their world. Despite being the shorter of the two, it was nevertheless the second longest word I had ever seen. I began saying it slowly, and as I did, it took on a beat similar to a stream of lines without breaks. I said it over and over. As the flow improved, I began to feel it out more and became aware of the word's alternating stress patterns. It was 3:46. I inhaled deeply and turned to face the sea. The Circadian ridge was buried a mile below the surface somewhere, ready to be exposed. Maybe all I was a lonely, bored landlord looking for some excitement. Even those that are false. 3:47. I started saying the word once more. I experienced an unusual tingle in my vocal cords when the flow picked back up. Around me, the streetlights started to flicker and darken. The seawall was struck by the rising tide that rose below. Then a retreat. After saying it once again, a blast of chilly air smacked my body. The sky was different. Water quality had changed. Everything was different. Behind me, the buildings had vanished. Roads, vehicles, and even the seawall. I was experiencing a complete sensory overload as I stood on a rocky embankment. It was all so overwhelming. The foul odor made me think of gutted sea creatures decomposing in dumpsters in the dead of July. Huge, bellowing miscreants were roaring, shattering my head, blowing out my eardrums, and shaking the ground beneath me. I experienced small ice crystals biting into my lungs with each breath I inhaled. The mist of the corrosive sea water irritated my eyes. However, none of those could match what I was looking at. Wherever the ridge might be, a never-ending cloud formation was forming above the ocean. Blinding lightning strikes were being fired deep into the ocean by a powerful electrical storm that was raging through the sky. Below the howling storm, a vortex was whirling. It's all there to welcome the massive influx of people from this dimension. The animals. Millions of them existed. From tiny rodents to things the size of skyscrapers, there were more than I could see. More dreadful and unfathomable than the paintings dared to depict. Even from the great distance I was at, they emanated a dreadful energy about them that seemed like some sort of radiation hitting my flesh. I'd seen enough. When I went back to the paper with the text, I discovered that it had become wet. Shit. I protected it by holding it close and shielding it from the pouring, slightly acidic rain that was starting to erode it. I began aloud reading the first word. The extended one. The phrase that means our world. For that first word, I had gotten into the rhythm of the language, in whatever language it was written, and I was hoping the technical proficiency would carry over to this one. However, nothing was altering. I remained in place. And to make matters worse, I was recognized by the animals. Some of them began to retreat from the ridge and drew frighteningly close to me. I repeated the term over and over. And once more and again. However, nothing. The creatures were approaching. One of the smaller ones, about the size of a horse but with many more legs and 6 sets of jaws, was running in my direction with its lips open and piercing shrieks erupting from its Jovian voice cords. The word continued coming out of my mouth, singing it, and being said in various ways, but to no avail. When I looked back, I could barely see one of the creatures because it had just emerged from the water. It had a mass of tentacles that were massing and flailing about as it searched for something to suck into its enormous maw. I was able to see down into its stomach and down into its throat when its jaws opened. Looking into a Mandelbrot fractal was how it felt. Constantly evolving, while growing both within and externally. As they grew up from the stomach, faces, mouths, and teeth would appear and then vanish. I was aware that just seeing it had set off a mental switch, and any remaining sanity had left me. Never again would I be the same. If I make it through this. I was able to stammer out the word again in a short, flowing vocalization as the creature's maw was ready to close over my head. My senses were no longer being attacked. Once more, I was lying on the seawall bike path's harsh cement. I had returned to our planet. Although it was almost completely eaten away, the paper was still in my palm. I had no concern. I allowed it to fall into the sea and over the cliff. Walking back to my building was difficult. My chest and lungs hurt, and I didn't feel well. My body felt as though it had just completed a series of marathons. I entered the building by the back entrance, but I quickly realized I would not make it to my flat. I asked the police officer who had earlier helped me to take me immediately to the hospital when I stopped at his apartment. I experienced a sharp chest discomfort on the way there. It cut through the left arm of mine. Oh no! My heart was about to attack. After a week of operations and 3 weeks of rest, I was allowed to leave the hospital thanks to our timely arrival. I still had the journal in my safe. I deposited it upstairs in the professor's secret room after deciding that it was too dangerous to have. I sat down and had a serious talk with myself about burning it one sheet at a time in my sink. But came to the conclusion that perhaps someone would find the knowledge in it useful at some point in the future. I'll be keeping an eye on the seawall till that time comes. And keeping an eye out for a rising tide and then diminish.